This is Monday. This is May 11th, and I am sort of trying to summarize an almost impossible chapter to summarize, which is chapter 2 of Pascal Boyer's Religion Explained, The Evolutionary Origins of Religious Thought. This Now, the basic point of the chapter seems to be that religious concepts are not sort of this wild imaginative thing that happens that's sometimes assumed by people who are not very notably religious, that superstition itself is quite a wild or strange thing. But the first thing he debunks is this idea of strangeness, which he says the problem with looking at the strangeness of any particular religious concept is strange to whom, and it is a superficial way on the surface excuse me, to look at religious concepts. So he goes back to what he has been talking about in the previous chapter. He uses the Venn diagrams that he has used. I know you can't read this, but this is a Venn diagram for a fictitious animal called a zygoon. And it says, zygoons are predators of hyenas. That's the information that one receives. And that makes the ontological category, or the ontological entry, animal. Zygoon is an animal. And so it grows, it dies, it has typical shape, it needs food for survival, and reproduces within the same species in the same way. Those are just inferences when we say that something is an animal. We automatically know something about that, even though we've never heard of this. The zygoon is the concept. The ontological category is the template. He has another one called a thrickler, which is a tool. The ontological category is tool. And what we know about tools is they're man-made. They're not natural. They have a defined function by goals. They shape this function, and it's inanimate. We know that tools are inanimate. The concept, the template, is tool. The concept is thrickler in this case. The ontological category is ontological just means being. The being category for it is tool. Now those are both fictitious examples, but that sort of helps actually. And he has a little bit of jargon in this chapter. Inference, we infer things, and the mind works in that way in a lot of different ways. For instance, my favorite is we have two eyes, and our two eyes have a slightly different perspective. In photography, we would call that there is parallax between them. They don't have the same. And if you open one eye and open the other, you realize that the thing is, first of all, flat, and second of all, it's not quite in the same place. What the mind does, because we actually see with the mind, we only perceive with the eyes, what we see with the mind is actually a three-dimensional inference from the information that's coming in from the two eyes. That's what the brain does all the time, over and over again, lots of different. Now, this is a physical way of thinking about it, but in a conceptual way, we do it a lot of different ways. So when we run into a new thing, a category, whatever, we look at its ontological category. In other words, what is it? It's a tool. It's a person. It's an animal. And behind each of those ontological categories are assumptions that we make. We infer these things. So what that means is we get a little bit of information, and we expand that information quite a bit by its ontological category. Now, we have expectations about it because of its ontological category. Now, there are sort of default inferences that come from an ontological category, and what happens in the religious realm is that one particular part of the ontological category is violated. So, for instance, you have the ontological category of person, but you have a humanoid that seems to be driven to eating, but has no, doesn't speak, doesn't do a lot of the things that persons do. But that's a violation of the ontological category of person. So a person, if you think of a zombie, that's the ontological category of person, but the violation, of course, is that what you expect from a person is mental processing, communication, all those kinds of things that a person does, and the zombie doesn't. So the ontological category is violated. And that's how we get to religious concepts. There's one violation. Now, the interesting thing is, experimentally, they've done things to show that more than one violation is kind of hard to follow. If they tell stories to different people from different cultures, little lines of data, like an ebony tree overhears conversations. So ebony tree is a plant, a tree, and it overhears and remembers conversations. Now, notice I didn't say remembers the first time through. You knew instantly that when I say it overhears conversation, that memory is inferred. Your mind just adds that to the, so you get this little bit of data, but your mind expands it to quite a bit of data. So you have the ontological category of plant, but you have the specific concept of an ebony tree that overhears conversation. So you have a special ebony tree, all plant features, plus recalled conversations. That is the violation of the ontological category, and that is the that makes it, in this case, a supernatural, not natural, in other words, supernatural concept. Now, he expands this idea of supernatural concept with the term counterintuitive. He has this section called counterintuitive biology. And what it means is, so a simple violation of expectations occurs when we attribute physiological or other biological processes to a category that does not intuitively include biology. We get a lot of that from the Aymara people in the Andes. Describe a particular mountain as a live body with a trunk and head and legs and arms. The mountain is said to have physiological properties. It bleeds, for instance, and it feeds also. So they feed it. They give it food. it's a sacred mountain, but it's the only one that they think this of. All the other mountains are just regular mountains, that their ontological category is the same. There's no violation. But this particular mountain is sacred, and it has this biological component, which is a violation of the ontological category. And that makes it supernatural. There are many different supernatural things, but there are an interesting thing is that many of the supernatural concepts, or maybe not many of them, but some supernatural concepts occur in many different cultures. So the idea of a phantasm, a ghost, occurs in most, not all perhaps, but in many cultures. And the idea of metamorphosis, a caterpillar turning into a butterfly. That's the biological process. But metamorphosis is often an analogy or a metaphor for a sort of radical change. Enkidu is a half-human, half-animal composite, which is in Gilgamesh, for instance, the method. Okay, so the supernatural imagination, as far as Boyer is concerned, is much more structured than we think. First, the transformation is not complete. That is, the prince who turned into a toad has not literally become a toad. If he had, the story would stop there. In other words, he's still the prince as a toad. So the ontological violation is a toad, and an animal of a lower order is inhabited by a prince. Second, the choice of species or kind of object is itself constrained by intuitive ontology. So what works is fine. The ontological categories need to be sort of next to each other. A really great violation of the ontological category of machine is an ad that has a man's torso on a motorcycle. So that those are two categories not close to each other. So when we look at it, we know it's an ad, we know it's not serious, but it's trying to sell something, is what advertising does. But those two ontological categories are not close. The ones that work in religious concepts are close to each other. Anyway, counterintuitive mentation. So we have this idea of ebony trees that are that remember conversations, but they're restrained in their memory. They don't remember conversations that haven't happened yet, and they don't remember conversations they haven't heard. So they have this sort of the same constraints, mental constraints, that a human has. We overhear a conversation, we might be able to repeat it to somebody, but a future conversation or one that we didn't hear, we cannot repeat. So you can see that that's a violation of the ontological category, the being category of being, but it is just a small violation. Okay, so Okay, so he goes on and talks about the templates as templates in religious concepts. Now, he gets kind of technical here, anthropologically technical, not technical as far as he's concerned, I'm sure. But he points out that when it has to be a violation for it to be interesting, to be a concept that is durable in culture. If it's merely just a biological change to a biological organism, that is not really a violation, and it isn't really memorable. So let me see if I can give you an example. All right. All right, we're into templates for religious concepts. Let's see, our intuitive ontology, our intuitive sense of being, the process that infers things from very little data, places strict conditions on what we have in the mind. So it assumes that minds form perceptions because of actual events that occur in their environment. So one, it comes from reality. And two, as a result of these perceptions, minds form beliefs about what happened. So the inference comes from real experience. In our intuitive concept of the mind, there are causal links that go from events to perceptions and from perceptions to beliefs, not the other way around. So listen to that again. The causal links go from events to perceptions and from perceptions to beliefs. So somebody might talk about the Trinity as a belief, but the church and the thinkers in the church didn't get to the Trinity full-blown as a concept. They didn't start there. They started with perceptions. The perception was they had this incredible person in Jesus, and they didn't know quite what to do with him. How are we to think about this person? And so they gradually developed from perceptions, from the events, they developed perceptions or patterns, and then the patterns eventually developed into beliefs or dogma, as it would be called. Okay, so religious concepts comprise an ontological category, label, and a particular tag. So, let's see. Here's an example. Some people are dead, but they keep walking around. They cannot talk anymore, and they are not aware of what they are doing. So the ontological category of that is person. But the exception is they cannot talk anymore, and they are not aware of what they are doing. So their mental apparatus is not working in the same way that a person does. So it violates the person ontological category. The mountain over there, this one, not that one, eats food and digests it. We give it food sacrifices every now and then to make sure that it's in good health. Okay, so The ontological category is inanimate object, mountain, but the violation of that category is that it eats food. Okay, so that is a supernatural concept. It is a violation of the ontological. The religious concept preserves all the relevant default inferences except the ones that are explicitly barred by the counterintuitive element, meaning that that mountain, that one that eats food, that mountain has everything about a mountain that we would intuit, that we would infer from it being a mountain, except it eats food. That is the violation, the counterintuitive element, as they want to call it. And there are many examples, but here is, you see these. Now, we would describe this as a circle with a bite out of it, and this is a square with the spike on it. Impossible for computers to see that because they don't use an inference system. See, we'd look there, we'd see the circle, we'd see the square, and then we would define the object based on the inference that we have on the ontological concept, or which is a geometric form. The last part of the chapter is fairly complicated, a discussion of a number of different experiments to sort of enhance the ideas he's already, to sort of verify this idea that a supernatural religious concept is something that violates the ontological category in which it is in, but it doesn't violate a lot of it. It makes very sure that we understand that the violation is what makes it supernatural. And there can be other things different about it, but those things might be not part of they take away perhaps from the description of the concept, but they do not affect the ontological category in any profound way. Okay, well, the interesting thing is they, through experimentation, have discovered that memory effects do not change much with culture. And what they did was they tested various fictitious elements in different cultures, and they adjusted for bias because different cultures have different well, I suppose they have different ontological categories, but mostly everybody has pretty much the same one. So what happens is that the supernatural things like ghosts, which is a violation of the person category, it's a person who can walk through walls. It's a person who really can't affect something in reality, but is there somehow. But there is a person there, but the person can't fully express him or herself. That exists in many cultures, and it exists as a violation of the person, the ontological category of person. So well, I feel like I've repeated the same thing over and over and over again. They do have one interesting thing that's called theological correctness. And basically, it is making a point about the serious theological things and the less so. So, for instance, Santa Claus wouldn't be considered a serious theological issue, whereas the omnipotence of God would be serious. And the interesting thing is that the process for getting both to the serious and the simply not serious is the same mental process. Now, there is some memory difference when it comes to remembering something that's belief, and that is basically the crucial mistake is to assume that there is no point in understanding non-serious or folklore supernatural representations because they do not create strong emotional states in the individuals or trigger important social effects. The problem is that the mental process, the religious concept, is created by the same mental process. And so it is worth looking at the serious and the non-serious because they function very similarly in the way they develop. Serious religion makes use of the same notions found in non-serious repertoire, plus some additional features. And that's going to be the elaboration of that will be some of what we go on next to. The third chapter, which is next, is the kind of mind it takes. So I have probably not expressed fully the complexity of this idea, but it's of this chapter 2. It is a great chapter full of stuff, but the main point is that we have ontological categories, and one violation of that category makes it a religious or supernatural concept. I hope this has been helpful. Anyway, read the book. It's elegantly written.